It sits on rolling land west of the city of Guelph, on ground that, in the right season, turns green in a way that makes the buildings behind it look almost incidental, as if the fields came first, and the institution grew up among them by accident rather than design. The main building is red brick, late Victorian in its proportions, with a central entrance block and wings extending on either side in the symmetrical logic of an era that believed in the power of architecture to communicate intention. This was Guelph Reformatory, built in 1910 by the province of Ontario to receive boys and young men who had not yet committed serious crimes, but who had been identified by courts, by school boards, by parents, by neighbors, as the kind of people who might. It was built on the premise that the future could be corrected, that a boy on the wrong path could be redirected before the path led somewhere the province would have to deal with later. It was built to look like a farm and a school, because the province believed that honest labor and structured education were the instruments of that correction. To understand what Guelph Reformatory was built to be, you have to understand what Canada believed about crime in the final years of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th. The late Victorian and Edwardian social reform movement in English Canada operated under a set of convictions that were, taken individually, genuinely progressive, and, taken together, capable of producing enormous harm. The progressives of this era believed that crime was not a moral failure, but a social product, that poverty, immigration, broken families, and inadequate education produced criminals the way bad soil produced stunted crops, and that the correct response was not punishment, but intervention. This was a real departure from the punitive theology that had governed criminal justice for centuries. The men and women who held it believed they were building something better. The intervention they imagined was early. Not early in the criminal career, early in the life. The theory of the era, absorbed from American criminologists and British social researchers, and filtered through the particular anxieties of a rapidly industrializing colonial dominion, held that the criminal type could be identified before it fully formed. The warning signs were legible in childhood: truancy, petty theft, vagrancy, what the era called waywardness, what it also called incorrigibility. A boy who exhibited these signs was not yet a criminal, but he was, in the language of the reformers, a future criminal, and the future, unlike the past, could be changed. The industrial training school was the instrument of that change. Ontario already had reformatories at Penetanguishene and Mimico, but these were increasingly understood as reactive, places for boys already caught, already processed, already partly formed in the direction of wrongdoing. What the reformers wanted was something earlier in the chain, something that could intercept boys before they had done anything worth prosecuting, and redirect them while their characters were still malleable. The province of Ontario in 1910 was governed by men who took this theory seriously, and who had, in the prosperity of the Laurier era, both the resources to act on it and the political will to do so. The government of James Whitney approved the construction of a new facility on agricultural land west of Guelph, land that would allow the institution to sustain itself partly through farm production, demonstrating to the public and the legislature that the reformatory was not merely a cost, but an investment in social order. The language used in the legislature to authorize the construction was the language of optimism. Words like reclamation, restoration, the salvage of young lives. The members who voted for the appropriation believed they were doing something kind. They were building, they told themselves and each other, a place of second chances. Power in early 20th century Ontario flowed through a network of provincial officials, judicial appointees, and institutional administrators who shared a class background, a religious sensibility, and a conviction that they understood, better than the boys in question, better than the boys' families, what kind of person a wayward child would become if not corrected. That conviction was the most dangerous thing they brought to the project. Not malice, certainty. What certainty does, when it has institutional power and no external accountability, is precisely what happened at Guelph. The man appointed as the reformatory's first superintendent was a figure who embodied everything his era considered virtuous in the management of difficult young men, and everything that would later be understood as the precondition for systematic abuse. His name was James Edmund Roberts. He was born in 1863 in Brantford, Ontario, the son of a Methodist minister. He was educated at Victoria University in Cobourg, where he absorbed the particular synthesis of evangelical Christianity and social progressivism that characterized the reform movement of his era. He had served, before his appointment at Guelph, as superintendent of the Ontario Reformatory for boys at Penetanguishene, a position he held for 7 years, and from which he had emerged with a provincial reputation for firm, principled, effective management. His letters are preserved in the Ontario archives. They are the letters of a man who thought carefully, wrote clearly, and was entirely without doubt. He believed in the reformatory program with the intensity of a man who had constructed his professional identity around it. He believed that boys committed to his care were raw material, not defective material, he was careful to say, but unformed material, and that the institution's task was to shape them. Work, discipline, prayer, the regular rhythms of agricultural labor. These were the instruments, and he had no doubt about their efficacy. His first annual report to the province, filed in 1911, described the reformatory's program in terms that were, on the page, entirely consistent with the reform philosophy he had been appointed to implement. The boys attended school in the mornings. They worked the farm in the afternoons. They attended chapel on Sundays. The grounds were well maintained. The produce was adequate. The number of disciplinary incidents was, by his accounting, declining. What his annual reports did not describe was the instrument that hung on a hook in his office. The strap had been authorized by the reformatory's founding legislation as a corrective measure for boys who could not be reached by other means. Roberts interpreted other means narrowly. Boys who failed to meet production quotas on the farm were strapped. Boys who spoke after lights out were strapped. Boys who resisted the authority of a guard, regardless of the circumstances of the resistance, were strapped. The strap was not a last resort. It was a management tool. He accumulated commendations throughout his tenure. The provincial inspector, who visited annually, described the institution year after year as a model of progressive correctional practice. Roberts was presented to visiting delegations from other provinces and from the United States as an example of what reformatory management could achieve. He gave talks at correctional conferences. He was, by every external measure available to the early 20th century, a success. When he retired in 1929, the province gave him a formal dinner. The Attorney General spoke warmly about his decades of service. A silver commemorative plate was presented. He was never questioned about the punishment ledgers. He was never asked about Frederick Dawson. He died in 1937 with his reputation entirely intact. The strap stayed on the hook. His successors kept it there. The physical reformatory that Roberts built, and his successors expanded across 4 decades, was designed to communicate, through every architectural and spatial decision, that what was happening inside it was ordered, productive, and purposeful. The approach road, lined with those deliberately planted trees, was the first communication. By the time a boy arrived, brought by court officer, or by police, or, in some cases, by his own parents, he had traveled through enough managed landscape to understand that this place had intentions about appearances. The main entrance block presented a face of institutional seriousness. Red brick, regular windows, a central door that was neither welcoming nor forbidding, but simply present, the way the door of a factory is present. Behind the entrance block, the complex spread across the agricultural land in a configuration that reflected the dual nature of the institution's stated purpose. To the north, the farm buildings, barns, silos, equipment, sheds, the fields themselves. To the south and east, the residential blocks where the boys slept, the school building, the chapel. At the center of the residential complex, connecting the blocks, a covered corridor that the institution called the main passage. The boys called it the tunnel. The tunnel was where punishment was administered publicly. Not every punishment. The strap in Roberts's office was a private instrument between the superintendent and the boy. But the formal disciplinary exercises that the institution employed for collective infractions, the marching drills in silence, the standing at attention for periods that the punishment ledger records in hours, these took place in the tunnel, visible to whatever boys happened to be moving through it, which was the point. The farm fields were the largest feature of the grounds, and they were also the most revealing. The institution produced wheat, oats, hay, vegetables, dairy products, and pork. The produce offset a significant portion of the institution's operating costs. The boys' labor generated that produce. The boys' labor was described in the annual reports as vocational training in agricultural methods. In the punishment ledger, when a boy failed to meet the day's production requirement, the stated reason for disciplinary action was insufficient effort. The school building was genuine, in the sense that instruction occurred inside it. It was insufficient, in the sense that the boys who entered the reformatory without reading skills and left 4 years later without them had attended school in that building every morning for 4 years. The school's operating budget, relative to the farm's, tells the story. The farm received capital investment year over year. The school received whatever was left. The dormitory blocks at night were locked from the outside, not from within. A boy who needed to use the bathroom after lights out was expected to use a bucket at the end of the dormitory row. The bucket was emptied in the morning. This arrangement was described in the institution's annual maintenance reports as adequate for hygienic management. There was one room in the residential complex that did not appear in the publicly available floor plans filed with the Provincial Department of Public Works. It was located in the basement of the East Residential Block. The boys called it the hole. The punishment ledger called it the segregation facility. It measured, by the dimensions that can be inferred from the surviving maintenance records, approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. It had no window. It had a ventilation slot near the ceiling. Frederick Dawson spent his last 11 days there. The chapel, which stood at the eastern end of the main passage, was the most carefully maintained building on the grounds. The provincial inspector's reports, year after year, noted the chapel's good condition with a particular satisfaction. It was the most visible evidence that the institution's intentions were, at their foundation, spiritual. The institution's intentions were not, at their foundation, spiritual, but the chapel looked exactly as if they were, and the provincial inspector continued to visit once a year and file his report, and the reformatory continued to look, from the approach road and from the annual reports, like a farm and a school. The reformatory's active decades, from its opening in 1910 through the 1940s, were years of genuine institutional life in the sense that the place was fully inhabited, constantly operating, processing hundreds of boys through its system, and producing, for some of them, experiences that were not entirely without value. The farm genuinely taught some boys to work with their hands in ways they had not done before. The school genuinely taught some boys to read. The chapel gave some boys their first sustained exposure to music, through the weekly hymn singing that the superintendent required, and the choirmaster, a position always filled by an inmate identified as having musical ability, led from a small wooden podium at the front of the nave. These things were real. They existed alongside everything else, and the everything else was real too. The population of the reformatory in any given year between 1915 and 1945 ranged from approximately 200 to 350 boys and young men, ranging in age from 12 to 21. The committed offenses, or the conditions of committal, covered a remarkable range. Boys who had been caught stealing, boys who had been truant from school repeatedly, boys who had been declared unmanageable by their parents and brought to a magistrate who had signed the necessary form, boys who were recent immigrants, or the sons of recent immigrants, whose behavior had been interpreted through a filter of suspicion that had as much to do with their names and accents as with anything they had done. In 1922, the Wellington County Magistrate's records, cross-referenced with the reformatory's admissions ledger in a 1998 research project by historian David Wolfe, showed that 34% of the boys committed to Guelph in that year had no recorded offense at all. They had been committed on the basis of parental or school board declarations of incorrigibility, a legal category that required no specific act and no evidentiary standard. A parent's sworn statement that a child was beyond control was sufficient. A school principal's letter was sufficient. The magistrate's discretion was unconstrained. Among the committed population, boys from particular backgrounds appeared in numbers that reflected the biases of the committal system more than the distribution of actual delinquency. Irish Catholic boys, boys with Eastern European surnames, boys from the most economically distressed neighborhoods of Hamilton and Toronto and Brantford. Sent to the Wellington County Institution because the province's rural locations for reformatories reflected an assumption about where criminality originated and where its correction should occur, away from the city, in fresh air and honest labor, as far from whatever had formed them as geography could manage. Once inside, the institutional culture operated according to rules that the boys learned by violation. The formal rule book, a printed document issued to each inmate at arrival, titled Regulations for the Conduct of Inmates, covered 11 pages. It prohibited talking without permission, running in corridors, leaving assigned areas, failing to maintain personal cleanliness, and a category described as insolence toward staff that was so broadly defined as to encompass virtually any expression of displeasure. The informal rules were not written anywhere. They governed everything. A boy who made eye contact with a guard in the wrong circumstances had committed an infraction. A boy who ate too slowly was in violation. A boy who walked at a pace the escorting officer considered insufficiently purposeful was subject to correction. The informal rules were not arbitrary. They were the expression of a consistent, underlying principle that the boy's will, whatever it was the problem, and that the institution's function was its replacement. In the afternoons, on the farm, that principle found its most productive expression. The work quotas were not explained to boys in advance. They were revealed through failure. When a boy had not met the expectation became visible for the first time. This system ensured that a significant number of boys failed on any given day, which ensured that a significant number of boys were disciplined on any given day, which ensured that the disciplinary apparatus was never idle. The strap, the tunnel drills, the segregation cell, none of these sat unused for long. The boys who survived the system, who left at the end of their sentences intact enough to function, learned, most of them, not the lesson the institution intended. They learned that authority was arbitrary, that the rules changed when the person enforcing them wanted them to change, that compliance was not safety, because safety was not available. They learned, in the institution built to prevent criminality, the specific skills of the subordinated, how to appear cooperative while waiting, how to identify which staff members could be managed and which could not, how to calculate the minimum cost of each day. These were not the lessons in the printed rulebook. They were the lessons of the institution itself. The reformatory's physical life entered its first significant crisis, not through any internal event, but through the pressures of the 1930s, which arrived at Guelph as they arrived everywhere, as a sudden, overwhelming surplus of exactly the kind of person the institution had been built for. The Depression years produced, in Ontario as across North America, a generation of young men who were not delinquent in any meaningful sense, but who were visibly, publicly, undeniably in circumstances that the legal system of the era categorized as suspicious. Boys who had left home because their families could not feed them. Boys traveling on freight trains between cities that had no work for their fathers. Boys who were stealing food and sleeping in parks and doing, in short, everything that the vagrancy statutes of the era defined as criminal. The reformatory admissions between 1930 and 1937 reflect this flood. The annual intake numbers, which had run between 60 and 90 boys per year through the 1920s, jumped to over 140 in 1931 and remained above 120 through 1935. The institution, designed for a population it was already straining to manage, absorbed boys faster than its physical infrastructure could accommodate them. The dormitory, that had held 40 boys, held 65. The kitchen, designed to serve 200, served 320 on a Depression-era budget that did not increase proportionally to the population. The farm expanded. The province approved additional acreage in 1932 and 1933, not because expansion improved the institution's programs, but because the labor of the additional boys could work the additional land, and the produce could help offset the cost of feeding them. A staff member named Thomas Bray, who worked as an agricultural supervisor at the Reformatory from 1929 to 1941, and whose memoirs were deposited with the Wellington County Museum in 1978, wrote about the Depression-era Reformatory with a specificity that the official records lack. He described the winter of 1932 as a period when the dormitories were cold enough that boys slept in their work clothes, and the morning temperature inside the East residential block was regularly below freezing. He described a kitchen staff trying to stretch meal portions to a population a third larger than the catering budget anticipated. He also described, in the chapter of his memoir covering 1933 and 1934, the increase in what he called correction events, his term for disciplinary applications of the strap. He wrote, "When boys are cold and hungry and frightened, they do not become more compliant. They become less so, and the response to less compliance was always more correction. I watched that cycle turn for a decade, and it never resolved." He underlined "never resolved" and added a margin note in different ink, added later, "because it was never intended to." Thomas Bray's memoir was never published. It is available for reading at the Wellington County Museum by appointment. The provincial government has not cited it in any official document related to the reformatory's history. The superintendent through most of this period was a man named Arthur Gordon Sims, who had succeeded Roberts in 1929. Sims was a less ideologically committed man than his predecessor. His annual reports have a bureaucratic flatness that Roberts's evangelical certainty never did. But he was a loyal provincial administrator, and loyal provincial administrators in the 1930s understood that their first obligation was to manage their institutions without generating demands on the provincial treasury. He managed. The boys inside experienced the management, and the province, which had built the institution to save young men from becoming criminals, produced, across those years, a generation of young men who had learned, inside provincial walls, that the institution that claimed to care for them would let them freeze and cut their food and strap them for being cold and frightened. Some of them did become criminals. The province's records do not track the subsequent lives of released inmates with sufficient consistency to establish a rate. The records were not designed for that inquiry. They were designed to document the institution's operation. The operation is well documented. The outcomes are not. The truth about what was happening at the Guelph Reformatory did not emerge through journalism or public advocacy or the testimony of former inmates who had found powerful voices. It emerged, in the first instance, from inside the provincial government itself, from a review that the government commissioned, received, and then used for a purpose that was the precise opposite of the one its authors intended. In 1947, the Ontario Department of Reform Institutions commissioned an internal review of disciplinary practices at the province's reformatory facilities. The review was prompted not by public pressure, but by a series of incidents at Guelph and at the Ontario Reformatory at Mimico that had generated interdepartmental correspondence between the superintendents and the deputy minister, that the deputy minister had decided required a formal response. The reviewer was a senior departmental official named Harold Waywright. He spent 6 weeks visiting the facilities, examining punishment ledgers, interviewing staff, and, in a departure from the standard practice for such reviews, interviewing a selected group of former inmates who had been released within the previous 2 years. His report, dated October 1947, was classified as confidential, internal use only at the time of its filing. It remained classified for 38 years, until it was identified by researcher Carolyn Brooks in the Ontario Archives in 1985 and obtained through a Freedom of Information request that was resisted by the Ministry of Correctional Services at the time, and ultimately succeeded only after a formal appeal to the Provincial Information and Privacy Commissioner. What Waywright documented was systematic. Boys as young as 14 were being strapped on their bare buttocks by senior staff for infractions that ranged from genuine violence to failure to complete assigned work to persistent sullenness, a category Waywright noted appeared in the punishment ledger without any definition. The number of strapping incidents recorded in a single month at Guelph, October 1946, the month he examined in detail, was 94. There were approximately 280 boys in the institution that month. 1 in 3 boys had been strapped in a single month. He documented specific incidents. A boy of 15 strapped 7 times in 30 days. A boy of 13 strapped within his first week of arrival. A boy described in the punishment ledger only by his number, 2291, strapped on consecutive days for what the ledger listed as refusal to cooperate, an entry that repeated without variation across 11 sequential entries. Waywright's recommendations were unambiguous. He recommended the immediate abolition of corporal punishment in all provincial reformatory facilities. He recommended the introduction of trained psychological staff. He recommended a formal complaints process accessible to inmates. He recommended that the punishment ledgers be reviewed by an independent inspector on a quarterly basis. The provincial government received his report in November 1947. The Deputy Minister of Reform Institutions read it. The minister read it. The office of the Premier was briefed on its contents. In February of 1948, the province issued a new administrative directive on disciplinary procedures at reformatory institutions. The directive did not abolish corporal punishment. It formalized it. It established a written procedure for the administration of the strap, the number of strokes permitted per infraction, the requirement that a second staff member be present as witness, the documentation standard for the punishment ledger entry. It replaced the informal violence that Waywright had documented with a bureaucratic procedure that produced the same outcome with official authorization. The directive described itself as a modernization of disciplinary standards consistent with the recommendations of the 1947 review. Harold Waywright had recommended abolition. The province produced legalization. It cited his review in the preamble of the document that made his findings irrelevant. Waywright's subsequent correspondence with the deputy minister, 3 letters over the following 6 months, each more pointed than the last, received responses that thanked him for his service and noted that the matter had been addressed. His name does not appear in any subsequent provincial document related to reformatory discipline. He retired from provincial service in 1951. He was given a watch. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Frederick Dawson was 16 years old in March of 1919. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Hamilton, the second of 4 children of a Scottish immigrant laborer named William Dawson and his wife Agnes. His school records, traced by researcher David Wolfe in his 1998 archival study, describe him as a boy of average intelligence and irregular attendance. The irregular attendance was explained, in a teacher's note from 1916, by the fact that Frederick was frequently kept home to help care for younger siblings when Agnes was ill, which was often. He was committed to Guelph in January of 1918 on a magistrate's order that cited his mother's declaration of incorrigibility. Agnes Dawson had gone to the magistrate after Frederick refused, for the second time, to return to school following a period of home care. He was 16 years old and had been managing his family's household during his mother's illness. He refused to return to school because the younger children still needed supervision. The magistrate signed the order. Frederick was transported to Guelph by rail. He spent 14 months inside the institution before the incident that resulted in his placement in the segregation cell. The specific infraction that preceded his placement is not recorded in the surviving portion of the punishment ledger. The entry for the week of his placement shows water damage that has rendered several lines illegible. What is recorded is his entry into the segregation cell on February 21st, 1919, and his death there on March 4th. His mother Agnes received a letter, dated March 7th, informing her that her son had died of cardiac failure and that arrangements for his burial had been made by the institution. The letter did not specify the location of his burial. When Agnes Dawson wrote to request that location, the response she received, dated March 19th, stated that the boy had been interred in the institutional grounds in a manner consistent with provincial practice. She never received a specific location. She died in 1934 without having visited her son's grave because she could not find it. His father William outlived her by 3 years. In 1937, he wrote a letter to the Ontario Department of Reform Institutions, requesting the location of his son's burial. The letter was received and stamped with a departmental receipt date. The response it received, if any was sent, is not in the surviving files. William Dawson's letter is in the Ontario archives. It is the last document in Frederick Dawson's institutional file. James Arthur Kerr was 17 years old in 1931 when he was committed to Guelph. He had been caught stealing bread from a bakery delivery wagon in Kitchener during the winter of 1930, his first and, at the time of his committal, only offense. The magistrate who sentenced him noted in the court record that Kerr had acted under manifest distress of circumstances. but concluded that a period of institutional correction was warranted given the boy's evident tendency toward property crime. James had been a butcher's apprentice before the Depression cost the butcher his business, and the apprenticeship with it. He had been working, in the months before the bread theft, whatever day labor he could find. He was not a criminal. He was hungry, and he stole food, and the machinery of provincial justice caught him at exactly the moment when it was processing more boys than it had ever been designed to hold. He spent 3 years at Guelph. He was strapped 11 times by the count that can be established from the punishment ledger entries that research has identified as corresponding to his inmate number. The reasons recorded: insufficient farm production twice, talking after lights out 3 times, insolence once, failure to attend to assigned duties with appropriate diligence 5 times, a phrase that could mean anything, and in the institutional context of the Depression-era farm, meant whatever the agricultural supervisor decided it meant that day. When he was released in 1934, James Kerr returned to Kitchener. He never worked in food service, which is what he had trained for before the arrest. The Guelph record followed him through the provincial system's reference checks, and the reference checks followed him through every application he made in the trade. He worked in road construction for 20 years. He married in 1941. He had 3 children. His daughter Margaret, in an interview conducted for a community oral history project in Wellington County in 2003, said that her father never talked about Guelph directly. He said only once, when she was a teenager, and asked about a scar on the back of his hand. "I got that in a place I was sent when I was your age. And if you take nothing else from me, take this. Institutions do not fix what they are built to fix. They only make it harder to fix it yourself." He died. In 1979, he received no acknowledgement from the province for what was done to him. No compensation was offered. No apology was made. Ruth Elaine Hodgson was not a boy. She was 19 years old in 1938 when she was committed to a female section of the Guelph facility, one of the lesser documented aspects of the reformatory's history. The brief period in the late 1930s, when a wing of the institution was adapted to receive young women committed under the Female Refuges Act, a provincial statute that allowed the committal of women deemed to be living in moral danger, which in practice meant women who were living independently, or who had had children outside marriage, or who were known to associate with men of whom the magistrate disapproved. Ruth had been living in Guelph after leaving her parents' home in Fergus. She worked as a seamstress. She had a relationship with a man she was not married to. A neighbor reported her circumstances to the local Children's Aid Society. The CAS referred the matter to the magistrate. The Female Refuges Act allowed commitment for up to 2 years. Ruth received 2 years. She was a skilled seamstress. Inside the institution, she was assigned to the laundry, not the sewing room, which existed, but which was reserved for shorter-term inmates. 2 years of institutional laundry. When she was released in 1940, she returned to Guelph. The seamstress work she had built over 3 years before her commitment was gone. The clients had found other arrangements. The shop where she had rented a workspace had closed. She found work as a domestic servant. She worked in domestic service for 12 years, until she married in 1952. She told her husband about Guelph on the night before their wedding. He told her, in the account she gave her niece decades later, that it changed nothing about how he saw her. She had spent 2 years in a provincial institution for living the life she had chosen to live. No crime, no harm to anyone, a neighbor's report, and a magistrate's signature. She died in 1991. The Female Refuges Act, under which she had been committed, was repealed in 1958. No compensation was ever paid to women committed under it. The provincial government's position, when the repeal was debated in the legislature, was that the act had been well-intentioned, and that its repeal reflected a modernization of the province's approach to social welfare. The women who had served time under it were not mentioned in the debate. These 3 stories represent a fraction of what the institution produced across 6 decades. Many former inmates never spoke about Guelph at all, because speaking about it required acknowledging that they had been there, and acknowledging that required accepting the stigma the institution's existence was designed to attach to anyone who had passed through it. Some found that silence was the most functional response. Some carried the institution inside them in ways that their families recognized without understanding. Some died with their institutional files still restricted, and their grandchildren unaware that the provincial record of their youth was locked in an archive that would not open until 2074. The provincial government's active management of the Guelph Reformatory's record did not begin with the 1947 Waywright Review. It began earlier, in the administrative practices that governed what information about the institution entered the public domain. The annual reports filed with the legislature each year were the primary public document. They were drafted by the superintendent, reviewed by the deputy minister of reform institutions, and tabled in the legislature as part of the department's annual accountability to elected members. The reports contained statistics, inmate population, admissions, discharges, farm production figures, school enrollment, chapel attendance. They contained descriptions of programs and improvements. They contained, in the section on discipline, aggregate numbers for corrective measures applied, a category that included the strap, the segregation cell, and the tunnel drills, combined into a single figure that gave no indication of how the total was distributed among the three categories or among the inmate population. What the reports did not contain: any mention of deaths inside the institution, any mention of the segregation cell's dimensions or conditions, any mention of complaints made by inmates or families, any mention of the results, however partial, of the magistrate's committal statistics that would have allowed a reader to determine what proportion of committed boys had no recorded prior offense. The provincial inspector, who filed an annual assessment of each institution, was not independent of the Department of Reform Institutions. He was a departmental employee, appointed by the minister, reporting to the deputy minister. His assessments were filed internally. They were not tabled in the legislature. They were not available to journalists or to the families of inmates. They were not subject to Freedom of Information requests until the Provincial Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act came into force in 1988. When the Waywright Report was classified in 1947, the classification was not unusual. It followed standard departmental practice for internal reviews. What was unusual was the deliberateness with which it was kept classified after 1948, when the new disciplinary directive had been issued, and the province might reasonably have considered the matter closed. Correspondence in the departmental files from 1952 and again from 1961 shows officials actively considering and rejecting proposals to declassify the report, on the grounds that its contents, if made public, would generate an unmanageable volume of inquiries from former inmates and their families. The Waywright Report was not declassified by government decision. It was identified by a researcher who knew to look for it, obtained through an appeal process that required 18 months, and first read by anyone outside the Department of Reform Institutions in 1985, 38 years after it was written. Harold Waywright, who had written it, was dead by then. He had died in 1971. His recommendations had not been implemented. The strap had continued in use at the reformatory until 1969, when corporal punishment in provincial institutions was finally prohibited by a ministerial directive issued in response to federal policy, rather than any provincial initiative. No one who had authorized the 1948 directive, the directive that legalized, rather than ended the practice Waywright had documented, was alive in 1985 to be asked about it. No one was charged. No inquiry was held. The ministry's response to Carolyn Brooks's publication of the report's findings in a 1986 academic article was a spokesperson's statement describing the reformatory as a product of its time, and noting that modern correctional practice has evolved significantly. The evolution was described. The accountability was not. The story of what was done at Guelph entered the public consciousness in fragments over decades, through the work of researchers who had to fight for access to documents that described events that had happened to people who had never had a mechanism for describing them themselves. David Wolf's 1998 archival study, published in the Ontario History Journal, was the first systematic scholarly account of the committal statistics and their relationship to class, ethnicity, and economic circumstance. It established, with documentary specificity, that the reformatory had functioned as a mechanism for the institutionalization of poverty as much as delinquency, that the boys committed to it in disproportionate numbers were the sons of recent immigrants, of unskilled laborers, of families in the deepest economic precarity, and that the legal category of incorrigibility had served as the instrument for that function. Carolyn Brooks's 1986 article in the Canadian Journal of Criminology, which brought the Waywright Report to academic attention for the first time, generated a brief period of heightened public interest that did not translate into government action. A journalist at the Toronto Star followed the article with a series of 3 pieces in 1987, interviewing former inmates, men in their 60s and 70s by then, who spoke for the first time on record about what the strap had meant inside the institution. The series won a regional journalism award. The provincial government responded with a statement describing the institution's practices as historical and noting that the reformatory had been substantially reformed by the 1960s. In 1993, a coalition of former inmates and advocacy organizations submitted a formal petition to the Ontario legislature requesting a public inquiry into historical abuse at provincial reformatory institutions. The petition named Guelph specifically. It cited the Waywright report, the punishment ledger statistics, the death records, and the 100-year restriction on the juvenile inmate files. The legislature referred the petition to the Standing Committee on Justice. The Standing Committee held 2 sessions of hearings in November of 1993. Former inmates testified. Researchers testified. A ministry official testified that the province took the concerns seriously and was reviewing its archival practices. The committee produced a report recommending that the restriction on juvenile inmate files be reduced from 100 years to 50 years, which would make the records accessible by 2024 rather than 2074. The recommendation was not implemented. The 100-year restriction remains in force. In 2019, a former inmate named Douglas Haynes, committed to Guelph in 1961 at the age of 15 for truancy, gave an extended interview to a documentary filmmaker working on a project about Ontario's institutional history. He was 73 years old. He described the strap in specific physical terms: the weight of it, the sound it made, the way the marks it left made sitting at the school desk the next morning a particular kind of attention to where the pain was. He said, "They told us we were being corrected. Corrected from what? I was 15. I hadn't done anything. My parents hadn't been able to get me to school on time. That was the crime. Late to school. And the correction was a strap on the back of your legs until you couldn't think about anything else." The documentary was completed in 2021. It has not been broadcast by any major Canadian broadcaster. It is available online. The province of Ontario has issued no formal apology to former inmates of the Guelph Reformatory. No compensation program has been established. The records remain restricted. The ministry's most recent public statement on the subject, in response to a journalist's inquiry in 2018, described the province as committed to learning from historical institutional practices, and noted that modern correctional services operate under a fundamentally different framework. The framework is different. The acknowledgement of what the previous framework did to specific people who are still alive to receive it has not been offered. The logic that produced the Guelph Reformatory did not remain inside Wellington County. It was, from the beginning, a logic that traveled, because it was not a local aberration, but an expression of a doctrine that spread from the settlement houses of Chicago to the reformatories of England to the training schools of every English-speaking province in Canada, and from there into systems and institutions that applied the same principles to populations that had even less power to resist them. The juvenile justice philosophy that underpinned Guelph, the conviction that the pre-criminal could be identified early and corrected institutionally before they caused harm, was the same philosophy that underpinned the residential school system. The residential schools differed from Guelph in the explicitness of their cultural program and in the racial targeting of their intake. They shared with Guelph the fundamental mechanism: remove children from their families before harm occurs, place them in an institution that controls every aspect of their lives, and call the control correction. The RCMP officers who transported Indigenous children to residential schools in the 1930s and 1940s were operating under the authority of the Indian Act in the same years that provincial police officers were transporting boys to Guelph under the authority of the Training Schools Act. Different statutes. The same institutional logic, that the state knew better than the family what the child required, and that the requirement could be met through institutional management. The residential school system's abuses, the deaths, the physical and sexual violence, the destruction of language and identity, have received, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 report, a degree of public acknowledgement in Canada that the reformatory system has not. The TRC's call to action 25 specifically named the historical record of child welfare institutions. Guelph is a child welfare institution. Its files are still restricted until 2074. The pre-crime intervention logic traveled further still. The American juvenile justice system of the same era, drawing from the same progressive era reform philosophy, produced the network of training schools and reform schools that populated the American South and Midwest through the first half of the 20th century. The Florida School for Boys at Marianna, known as Dozier School for Boys, operated from 1900 to 2011 and was closed after an investigation confirmed what former inmates had been reporting for decades: systematic beating, torture, and suspicious deaths, with bodies buried in unmarked graves on the institutional grounds. The University of South Florida's forensic anthropology team began excavating those graves in 2012 and found remains inconsistent with the official death records. The Dozier investigation produced, in 2012, a formal acknowledgement from Florida's Department of Juvenile Justice that abuse had occurred. It produced legislative resolutions expressing regret. It did not produce charges. No one who had administered the beatings was prosecuted. No compensation program was established. From Guelph to Dozier, different countries, different decades, different populations. The same premise, that children identified as pre-criminal could be corrected through institutional control. The same outcome, institutional violence, restricted records, partial disclosure, no accountability. The boys on whom the premise was tested did not choose the experiment. They were selected for it by courts and magistrates and parents and school principals who had authority over them, and whose authority the institution extended and intensified. Some of those boys are still alive. The records that document what was done to them will be restricted for another 50 years. The Guelph Reformatory still stands. The approach road still runs between those deliberately planted trees, and on a green day in early summer, it still looks almost like what it was designed to look like: a working farm, a managed landscape, a place where something productive is happening. The institution formally closed as a juvenile reformatory in 1978, when the province transitioned its functions to the adult correctional system and transferred the juvenile inmate files to the ministry archive under the restriction that remains in force. The physical plant was repurposed as the Guelph Correctional Center, an adult facility that operated until 2002, when the Harris government closed it as part of a provincial correctional consolidation. Since 2002, portions of the site have been adapted for other uses. The agricultural land is still farmed, under lease arrangements with private operators. The main residential block has sat largely empty, its red brick fading to a particular shade that is neither bright nor dark, but somewhere between the color of a building that is being neither maintained nor demolished, that exists in the institutional limbo of a province that has not decided what to do with it. The chapel is still there. It is the best preserved building on the site. This is not sentimentality on the province's part. It is structural. The chapel was built better than the residential blocks, its stone foundation more substantial, its roof maintained with greater consistency. It stands at the eastern end of what was the main passage, and its windows still admit light in the afternoon, in the way they were designed to do in the 1910s. There is no plaque on the main entrance block acknowledging the institution's history. There is no memorial to the boys who died inside it, Frederick Dawson, and however many others whose deaths were recorded in the institutional death register that remains in the restricted archive. There is no marker indicating the location of the institutional burial ground, where boys who died during their sentences were interred in the practice that prevailed through at least the first 3 decades of operation. Researchers who have sought access to the physical burial site have been referred to the Ministry of Correctional Services, which has referred them to the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, which has referred them to the Ontario Heritage Trust, which has referred them back to the Ministry of Correctional Services. The burial site's location on the grounds has not been formally mapped. No ground-penetrating radar survey has been conducted. The punishment ledgers that survive, a partial set covering certain years of the reformatory's operation, identified in the Ontario archives in the 1980s, are accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials for the years before 1921. The ledgers covering 1921 to 1978 fall within the restriction. The specific ledger that would contain the complete record of Frederick Dawson's 11 days in the segregation cell is in that restricted set. The strap that hung on the hook in the superintendent's office is not in the Ontario archives. Its location is unknown. It was an institutional implement, not a personal possession. And when the reformatory transitioned to adult corrections use, institutional implements were either repurposed, discarded, or transferred without specific inventory. No one thought to catalog it. No one considered it a historical artifact. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was the most historically significant object the institution produced. More significant than the farm statistics? More significant than the annual reports? More significant than the printed rulebook issued to each inmate at arrival? A piece of leather on a hook. It told the truth about the institution more accurately than anything the province ever filed with the legislature. The approach road is still there. The trees are large now. From the road, it still looks like a school. There are 2 Guelph Reformatories, 2 institutions that occupied the same red brick buildings and the same Wellington County land across 7 decades, separated not by time, but by who was writing the description. The first Guelph Reformatory existed in the annual reports, and the legislative debates, and the provincial inspectors' assessments, and the commendation dinners for retiring superintendents. That institution was a farm and a school. It received boys who were heading in the wrong direction and gave them honest labor and structured education and the corrective influence of disciplined routine. It was, in the language of the province that built it, a monument to the reforming impulse of the modern age, the belief that society had an obligation to intervene early, to invest in the salvage of young lives before the costs of inaction became prohibitive. That first reformatory was, in its own account of itself, a success. The second Guelph Reformatory existed in the punishment ledgers, and Thomas Bray's memoir, and Harold Wainwright's classified report, and Agnes Dawson's unanswered letter, and James Kerr's daughter's memory of a scar, and its explanation. That institution strapped boys who were cold and hungry and called the strapping correction. It placed a 16-year-old in a windowless cell and did not feed him after the 3rd day, and recorded his death as cardiac failure, and buried him in an unmarked location that his mother could not find. It committed women for living independently, and described the commitment as refuge. It classified the evidence of its own practices for 38 years, then used that evidence to produce a bureaucratic procedure that continued the practices with official authorization. Both institutions occupied the same buildings. Both were administered by the same province, funded by the same legislature, inspected by the same departmental officials. The first existed because the second needed somewhere to hide. The second needed somewhere to hide because the province that built it had decided, at the moment of construction, that the gap between what it intended and what it was willing to actually fund and oversee and hold accountable was a gap it could live with. The boys who fell into that gap are in the restricted archive. Their files will open in 2074. The questions that remain open over that Wellington County ground accumulate in a particular way. How many boys died inside those walls? The institutional death register covers the full operational period. It is in the restricted archive. How many of the deaths recorded in it were, like Frederick Dawson's, the outcome of conditions that a functioning accountability system would have prevented and a functioning justice system would have investigated? The archive will tell us. In 2074, will the province of Ontario, before the last surviving former inmate has died, issue an acknowledgement that uses the word wrong rather than the phrase historical practice? Will the 100-year restriction on the juvenile files be reduced to a period that would allow the people whose files they are, people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, still living, to read what the province recorded about them? Will anyone walk the grounds with ground-penetrating radar and establish where the boys who died inside the institution were buried, so that the families who have been asking the question for a century can receive something more specific than the institutional grounds? The province has not answered these questions. It has not been asked to answer them in any forum that carries binding consequence. The Standing Committee heard testimony in 1993 and produced a recommendation that was not implemented. The researchers published, and the journalists wrote, and the documentary filmmaker made his film, and the province issued its statements about evolving frameworks. The strap that hung on the hook outside the superintendent's office was described in the 1905 founding legislation as the corrective implement. It was introduced into the institution as a tool of measured, proportional, last resort discipline. By 1947, Wainwright's review had established what it had actually been: the primary instrument of management for an institution that lacked the resources, the training, and the will to manage any other way. By 1948, the province had taken that finding and used it to write a procedure that made the strap's continued use official policy. The corrective implement, a piece of leather, documented in legislation, hung on a hook, used on children. It is still correcting, in its way. It is still correcting the province's ability to say, without legal exposure, that what was done in that institution was wrong, and that the people who survived it deserve acknowledgement. The trees along the approach road are 100 years old. They are the largest things on that property now. They were planted to make the institution look settled and permanent and purposeful. They succeeded at all three. The building behind them holds its silence with the same practiced ease it always did. Some places are built to correct. Some places are built to conceal. Guelph Reformatory was built to do both, and it is still doing both right now, in the locked archive, in the unmapped burial ground, in the unanswered letters that were sent and received and stamped and filed and never answered.